Hi, everybody. Good morning or good evening, depending on where in the world you sit. Thank you for joining this session on climate change and how to cover it. I'll start by introducing this great panel we have. We have Mads Nyborg Strøstad, who is journalist at NRK in Norway. Also, we have Erik Rasmussen, a longtime editor-in-chief and now CEO of Sustainia, a sustainable think tank in Denmark. Also, we have Olivier Gilles, working at Reporters d'Espoir, meaning Reporters of Hope. Here they look how to support constructive journalism in France. And also this panel is situated in the Pacific, more specific in the south part of the Pacific Ocean at Tonga. And from here we have Eliezer Tora, who is the chairman of the Pacific Environment Journalist Network. And Eliezer Tora is also the president of Nuku'alofa Times in Tonga. Thank you to all of you for joining. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Sarah Goldsuk, and I work as a journalist at the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. And also, and that's more like the reason why I sit here, I have been a fellow at the Constructive Institute. And during my fellowship, I looked into how to cover climate constructively. And it's not like there's this big manual on how to do it, so that leaves a lot of space for us to have a good discussion on how we can do that today. During my fellowship, I saw a lot of good examples on how to cover climate from all over the world. And one of them was something you did, Mads, and we'll get back to that later. But first, I'd like if you could say a few words about yourself.
Yes, I'm a former sports journalist, actually, now covering climate for NRK. So I do digital storytelling for mobile first and foremost, and try to, well, my job is pretty much to try and experiment with new forms of storytelling digitally. So I've been at NRK now in Norway, Norwegian broadcaster for almost 11 years.
Okay, thank you. And then we will jump to France. Olivier, could you say a few words about your work?
Yes. So Reporters d'Espoir as an NGO is working since 2004 to promote French journalism, French solution journalism. So we partner with the main media from left to right, and we create several events. We have a prize journalists every year, and we have also a big event which is called La France des Solutions, where we promote initiatives on social, environmental, and media that talk about these initiatives. So we try to mix these several worlds.
Thank you, Olivier. And we go back to Denmark. Erik Rasmussen, could you say a few words about yourself?
Yes, I have been in the media business in more than 60 years. And where I have been, I have always focused on constructive journalism as an editor of different media. And right now I'm the founder of an international think tank called Sustainia, which focused on how we can provide constructive solutions and ideas within climate change and related issues.
Thank you. And this panel is also situated in the Pacific, more specific, the South Pacific Ocean on Tonga, where we have Eliezer Tora, because in Europe we also see consequences of the climate changes and all over the world, but I think it's fair to say that we don't see consequences like the ones you see in the Pacific. Eliezer Tora, could you start by telling what is the situation in Tonga?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel. I was excited when notified about the opportunity to be on the panel. Tonga currently is rated the second most at-risk country from natural hazards. And over here, because of the low-lying coastlines in most of the islands, the reality of climate change is, in fact, a daily issue. A lot of our low-lying islands are losing shorelines, um, and people who actually live on these islands face the risk of losing their livelihoods in the places where they live. In the bigger Pacific context, it is an issue that we see in most of the other low-lying islands like Kiribati and Tuvalu and Nauru. We see that in Fiji, in Papua New Guinea, in Vanuatu. So for us in the South Pacific, climate change is a real threat, and it is something that we can identify with each and every day of our lives. So
what is it like working as a journalist at the frontier of climate change?
Well, it's it's both a challenge and an experience, because experience in the sense that you live with it every day, and you see what is happening. And the challenge, of course, for some of us is getting to some of the outer islands where the impacts of climate change is real. You have to understand that most of the South Pacific countries are scattered. For Tonga, for instance, the islands are scattered all over, and the furthest island is closer to Samoa, which is another country around here. Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon's the same. And one of the things that we have tried to do as the Pacific Environment Journalist Network is encourage our members to tell the stories that that really affect the people out there. To go out and go to the islands, go to the villages, get these stories and tell them, because we've seen that in some instances, we have had stories that are covered that are not as true as they could be. And of course, that is something that we would like to do. We want to tell our Pacific stories, and we can relate with our people. So we want people out there to read the stories we tell in our Pacific way.
Okay. So climate change is without doubt one of the biggest story of our time, if not the biggest one. And we see the science is clear, it's getting warmer, and humans are the cause of it. And basically we need to act now, or else it will deeply affect the future. And we know that cutting down emissions demands huge transformation of the society, of the energy sector, of the agricultural sector, and so on and so on. We need huge transformation. And my question is, what about the media sector? Do we need to change? I'd like to start by asking you, Erik, what do you think do media need to change?
Yes, really. I have been dealing with climate change for a number of years, and I've heard this version: we need to act now, and we should have acted long ago. Now we are passing tipping points. And I think one of the big responsibilities lie on the media. They have to redefine their role. It's not just about how to cover this, but how do they change their situation, their raison d'etre in this situation, because this is it's not just an ordinary story you have to cover. It's a defining situation which really defines the role of the media in the future. And I'm quite sure the way we do it, it decides how relevant media will be for the future. Because we have a lot of people out there. They get scared. They get really moved around around issues they don't really understand. So they can make you get scared. So I think that the media have to find out how does this affect your role as the media? How can you be the GPS system will really help the readers, the viewers to guide in this uncharted water? And we can come back to that, but I think when you're looking back 10 years from now, you'll find out if this crucial moment really was a breakthrough for serious and constructive journalism or the reverse, because I think you will never ever get such a defining moment as we face right now. So therefore, I think it's not just about how you cover it, but how you reinvent and understand your role as the media in a very transformative period, and we'll be doomed and replaced depending on what we do right now, the years to come.
Okay, thank you. Media do tend to focus on problems and on conflicts and disaster, and you can say that climate change is all of it. But as Eric, as you said, it also leaves people feeling, depressed or left without hope, and maybe even shutting down the news. But are there alternative approaches? I know that, Olivier, you have done a report on how media in France is handling the climate issues, based on an analysis of the media during the last 10 years. What does that show?
Well, first, it shows that the media coverage about climate change and environment is increasing. So in France, there are two turning points in 2015, the COP21 in Paris, of course, and in 2019 with all the events in Amazonia and so on. What we could say is that the climate change in 2010 in the French media was not treated at all, almost not at all. And now it's mainly just 1%, or for instance, on the French radio, it's not treated during the daily express on the morning. It's treated within chronicles. So that means a lot that the climate change for the French media, or the French radio at least, it's not a subject that is included in all the news. It's a subject that goes in chronicles, and that's what still has to change. But yes, what we can see also is that, of course, French media covered most the catastrophes, much more than solutions. But yes, we can expect an increase, and it's happening.
So you say that media tend to look for conflicts rather than solutions.
Yes, of course, but it's not that simple. We also have great examples. For instance, we noticed an article in Financial Daily published last year, and it was a perfect article because the journalist talked about several solutions, and that was the main point of the article, presenting all of the solutions. It was to reduce the gas emissions from the cargo ships, and at the end, the main simple solutions was the most efficient. It was just to reduce the speed of the cargo ships, and that was for us a good illustration of what is constructive journalism. That means presenting several solutions, criticize them, and then yes.
Thank you, Olivier. We also know that media has a huge role in getting information to the public, and so does science. And during my fellowship, I did this workshop with Nordic journalists and Nordic scientists, climate scientists, in order to try to bridge the gap or between science and journalists, and to see what we could learn from each other. And one thing that the journalists and the scientists agreed on was that we need hope. We need so much more hope. And because this shouldn't be a debate about extinction, there will be generations after us to come. And one of the scientists said, I'll read up the quote, that the people who are alive right now are really setting the thermostat for the planet for potentially tens of thousands of years. And that was a climate scientist, Kimberly Nicholas, from Lund University in Sweden. And she was basically underlining that we are fully capable of doing something to stop climate changes and getting worse if we see possibilities. Mads, you were part of that workshop. How do you think that we put hope into journalism?
Well, just focusing on the solutions, like both of the former speakers said, I think is a very, very easy and good way to start. Personally, I also feel it's quite important to cover the dramatic changes that are happening. So it's funny that I've been invited to the constructive journalism panel, because both of my biggest stories are focused on the climate effects, and in that way are not constructive in the most obvious sense of the word. However, what we've done in those stories is a couple of things. These are stories where we've told our readers about the climate changes in Norway, the first one in the present and the second one in the future. And what we've tried to do is to focus on, first of all, not to focus on the worst case scenarios. We go for the middle scenarios, or the more optimistic ones. Also, we try to present both sides of the story to be as nuanced as possible within the frameworks of good storytelling. And the third thing is we also try to end the stories with some sort of call to action. And in both stories, we've actually ended with a big link to a longer story on possible solutions, both for you and I, and also for politicians. So this is the way we've tried to sort of mash or dark stories into a more constructive box, if you can say.
Yeah, because when you see the first stories you did were chasing climate in Norway, where you zoomed into a local scale to see what is going on here. What struck me was it's pretty, it's visible to see that changes are happening, but at the same time, like undramatic. Is that a choice you made when doing the story?
Yes, I would say so. Well, mostly it's just that in Norway we are quite lucky so far. So the actual consequences are quite I don't know, calm so far. So that also, but a lot of journalists, and I think I probably could have done this earlier in my career as a journalist as well, would try to take those small changes we see in Norway and try to tune them up and use big words and dramatize them, just to make sure we really get a grip of our readers, to make it interesting enough. But we've tried to go the opposite direction, and I think we trust that climate change is striking enough in itself that we don't have to overdo it.
Elias Tora, I'd like to ask you, do you think that it's necessary to use drama in order to make people understand the climate change? Because from where you sit, it's super visible. But how do you work with journalism? Does it make sense to talk about solutions and hope when you live in the Pacific?
Yes, it is very much looking at solutions. As I was saying, in the region, we look at the media providing two avenues. One is to educate. So we talk about what can be done, why this is needed to be done, and then report on the realities on the ground. Realities on the ground in the sense of reporting on what is actually happening, so that people can read it, can hear it on radio, can view it on television or video, so that then helps them, helps them to understand. And then I think over the last 12 months, the regional countries at the forum leaders meeting, have been talking about involving all the stakeholders, the private sector, the women and children, to make sure that everyone understands what is happening, and looking at the solutions that can be implemented so that the communities and the countries are resilient.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tora. And Erik Rasmussen, I'd like to ask you, why is it so important that journalism take action on climate change?
It is because journalism and media, they have a direct contact to people every day in a very large number. So therefore, they should be the link between what's happening out there, what science says, and how people change behavior. And when we're talking about hope or fear, I think we have to focus on reality. It's both fear and hope. We have to remind us what really it has changed people to, what it really have made people change behavior lately. It's because you have the threat out there and then you change behavior. You have seen it with the corona, then suddenly you have this threat around you and you change behavior. But don't leave the people there. Take them with their hand and help them how to guide them through this, because it's this is a new reality of life. And therefore the media has to be the guiding hand, the navigator, whatever you call it, to help people understand, yes, so is the reality. It's harsh, it's tough, but we are here to help you. And they have to see the media as a guide, their friend. And in spite of how serious it is, there's always a solution ahead. But so for me, it's just to find out that the media, they are as I said, they are the guiding, the guide to the people. I don't think they really understand that role enough, because, as I said, it's you cover it up and down and a little more or less, but the real issue and the real challenge is really to understand how you can develop a new kind of constructive journalism that really are on the side of the readers and the viewers. And I think too much journalism is too much connected to politics, to business, to sciences, and not too much to people itself, so they can see themselves, what should I do? Because they feel helpless. They feel that this is too huge. How can how can I make a difference? So to make that connection between science, you talked about your scenario, your workshop, and it's really true, because most of the scientific articles, I'm a hobby in really reading the most unreadable scientific reports. They are all thrillers, almost thrillers. But what happens to them? And therefore, the way you translate it, the more you make it relevant for people themselves. But as I said, it's okay that you are in stormy weather, but don't leave the people out there alone on the sea. You have to help them get it on board, get in back on land. So I think that media, the media plays an extremely important role. And if they do it right, I'm quite sure this is the moment, the defining moment, where the serious media working on constructive journalism can develop a new kind of future, really being the test case when people really were at need, really felt alone, really felt helpless due to all these catastrophes, because there will be more and more of them and will accelerate. That here they really could distinguish between social media and constructive medias and why there's a big difference. So in 5-10 years, when we have such a new discussion, we should look back and say, okay, we learned the lessons, and that was the defining moment, the really big turn of constructive journalism, because we realized it was very threatening. It changed our way of life. It changed our future. But somebody, the media, really understood their new role and changed behavior and changed people to understand how serious it is. So I think there's a huge innovation job to do for journalism, to reinvent, to re-understand this fantastic moment in the history of journalism. So,
thank you. Mads, do you agree it is the journalist's role to guide the audience in these matters?
Well, I think I quite agree with Erik. However, I think it's going to be a bit of a mental change for a lot of journalists, because we are so ingrained in the notion that just finding the facts and presenting them and covering conflicts and so on is our role. However, I do quite agree with you, and my main point is also that I think it's very important for us as journalists to solve the problem we have been having for some years, at least in Norway, where we can't really seem to engage people with our stories. And so what I do in most of my work is to try to figure out how to make people read those stories, just in practice, just how to write them, how to cover them. But I think a lot of journalists and also bosses in the journalism industry are very, I don't know, controlled by what the readers want. If it doesn't click, then we don't do it. And I think the good news in regards to what you are saying is that it seems, at least for us where I work, that the constructive angles on climate change is something people really want. So there's no big problem. There's no opposition between covering climate change constructively and getting our readers and selling newspapers. So I think that's great news for the next few years of journalism, because we're seeing this very clearly in our numbers now. The real depressive stories, people don't want to read them.
And Olivier, you are nodding your head. You agree with Mads?
Yes, I agree. And just after the study we published last summer, we conducted some interview with NGO activists and journalists, and they had a very balanced opinion about constructive journalism, because to raise awareness from the population, you don't have also to cover only catastrophes, but they told us that work to be very clear about the scientific data and from IPCC, etc., and that after you get the importance, you get the real issue, that's only after that you are able to accept the huge effort to do. So they told us, of course, we have to be constructive, we have to talk about solutions and more, but we also have to not to work on the fear, but to be very, very clear about the facts, which are scientifically checked.
On another part, when talking about constructive journalism, it's also the thought of bringing people together. And when talking about climate changes, I think easily it becomes sort of a bashing of what is the right way to live your life and the wrong way to live your life. So thinking about creating a dialogue where audience that may not agree, but be able to make audience, have a discussion, even though they find, despite their differences. How do we do that? How do we make people have a dialogue that brings them together instead of, polarizing a society? Eric?
Yes, I just mentioned that together with the Constructive Institute, we are just starting an experiment on part of Denmark called Funen. And together with 4 local media, TV and written media, we are trying to find out what kind of role could media play in trying to, as you said, create a new dialogue with people. There are 500,000, and they will be part of a big experiment which takes place next year. And the idea it is to, how can they be the catalyst of a dialogue with people? And we try to find out when some of these media, they, develop and publish some results, how will be affected by people out there? And then we test it to find out how do you relate, given constructive journalists and constructive journalism to people. What do they see? How does that really affect their behavior? And it is just a kind of experiment, kind of lab we do exactly to answer this question, that we may sometimes see this is a great story. We feel it in the editorial part. Great story, yes. For whom? Was it a great story for somebody out there? So therefore, we make this real test over a period of time, and we have it all lined up as a part of what does constructive journalism mean for people out there? Do they react it? And what's the difference between this kind of story, and what is the difference on their behavior? And this kind of lab work, this kind of research, we have to do much more. And as Matt pointed out, the biggest problem is between the ears. It's the mindset in the journalistic field. I've been there for 60 years. I've been editor of different papers, and I always find, to be very bold, journalism hasn't changed that much for these 60 years, because we do it the same. This is a good story, this is a bad story, and so forth. And what has happened with media? All the paid media, they go down and down and down. Why? Have you ever thought about that the biggest news you never wrote about, it's the news about your own future? That's So therefore, we have to reinvent what is news to people in a given situation. That's why we now, in the Sustainer, as I talked about, together with Constructive Institute and 4 defined media, now we want to have the answer to these crucial questions we have been asking ourselves for so long time with so little result. Because, I mean, is it a good business to make print medias or no? With a little help of the state, that's not the way to do it. So now at least we try to come up with an answer.
So looking into the future, you did that, Mads. And I can see time is running, and we are almost finishing up. But before, I'd like to just briefly hear all of you about what would you like to see more of in journalism in the future. Mads, you can go.
I could probably list up 100 things. But to me, I really want the future journalists to try to cover climate change, not in 100 small stories, but to instead give people an overview, explain people, really do it properly when you first do it, put in the time. That's not how everyday life in a newspaper works. But what we've experienced is that we can write 100 stories, normal news articles, and but if we write one extremely well thought out or thorough story where we put in the time, this one story will gain more readers online than all those small stories combined. So if we somehow can turn in that direction, at least, I think all of these other things would eventually sort themselves out, because if you put in the time to really think this through, and you have to do that if you spend months doing a story, right, or weeks, then I think it will help us quite a bit. And I think that's an important thing, not just in in climate journalism, but in all journalism.
And Olivier, just briefly, what would you like to see more of in the future?
Yes, I agree with Mads, but I would say also trying to be more global while talking about the problem, which is global. And as we could see with our study, the local newspapers, usually they are more constructive and talking about how could be a solution on a local way. And so, yes, I would say talking about the problem as a global problem and involving your readers with the solutions.
And Eliesa Tora, just briefly from you in the Pacific, where climate change hits really hard right now, what would you like to see in the future more of in journalism?
More constructive journalism, in the sense that stories that offer solutions. At the same time, more of our journalists really understanding the issues and before talking about it or before sharing it. The Pacific reporting on climate change is something that I can say is new to the newsrooms, because most of the newsrooms hardly gave the coverage that was needed about 10 years ago, but that has started to change, and it is something that the Pacific Environment Journalist Network and partners in the region are working on. But certainly would like to have more of those stories published, more of the reality stories on the ground, so that people can learn from those experiences.
Thank you. And the connection was a bit bad, but what I got from it was you want more solutions and you want journalists to know about what they're writing when they write about these matters. So Eric, I'll let you end this panel discussion with your take on what would you want more of in journalism in the future?
I hope that in 5-10 years from now, that the media will understand and read the lessons on the wall and the writing on the wall, that this is a profound moment for media really to understand and what their role is with climate change and pandemics and so forth. And there will be much better helping hand and guide to people to really change behavior and to understand how to act in these stormy weathers. So don't be scared, be prepared. And we help people to be prepared. I hope to see that.
Thank you so much. It's been super inspiring talking to all of you. Eric, Mads, Olivier, Eliesa Tora. So thank you for joining this session, and thank you to our great panel.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.